It always feels like coming home when I come back to Boise, and um, it's nice to have Antoinette here as well, and to see some familiar faces. It feels like it gets longer and longer from when I finished my dissertation, but I'm trying not to count the years anymore. So I'm also really happy to be back in Canada. As Enrica had said, I spent the last 4 years in the US, which is a very different context, I discovered. And I actually had a more challenging experience moving to the US than I did moving to France when I was doing my doctoral work. And that took me by surprise, in part because I was speaking the same language. We drove across the border, and suddenly I was in an entirely different, both linguistic and cultural context. And so I have said at times I'm recovering now, that I'm back in Toronto, and you will notice that I'm drawing on my plurilingual repertoire as I'm talking. And so sometimes you will hear slippages that are reminders that I've spent the last 4 years in the US, speaking to a US audience. And now that I'm back in Canada, I'm trying to return to speaking like myself as a Canadian. So bear with me, and we can talk more about some of these differences at the end if you'd like. So I had titled this Becoming Plurilingual Allies and Activists Fostering Cultural and Linguistic Collaboration in the Classroom. And I think that you read the piece that Mary Paul-Laurie, who is also affiliated here at OISE, we had been working on this notion of cultural and linguistic collaboration over the last number of years in our respective work. And the article was largely drawing on the American context where I was working, but conceptually, we've been talking about the truth and reconciliation process here in Canada and what linguistic reconciliation might look like. And for me, I've become very conscious of the fact as I was working in the US, and now when I'm back and working with FSL and ESL teacher candidates, that I am in a place of privilege teaching teachers to teach colonial languages, and that I need to be mindful of what gets erased in that process or what could get erased. And that's why I feel deeply committed to embracing plurilingual orientations to teaching, to recognizing that we have a responsibility to both honor what students bring into the classroom, but also what was already here before we arrived. And so that's where the notions of becoming allies and activists originated for me. And so I have an overview, and I realize that it might lie. I might not exactly do what I had proposed to do, but I want to talk a little bit about definitions, and I think they've come to mean more to me as I've changed contexts and I realize that they mean different things for different people. And then talk about my research context, the questions I've been asking, how I've been designing the work that I'm doing, and then this is more experimental. I've pulled out a number of classroom events from the last 4 years while I was in Madison, and I want to reflect with you about them and see what surfaces in terms of how we understand children's awareness of linguistic diversity. And then hopefully you'll have lots of questions. So to start out, I think I generally start from the assumption that schools have typically been monolingual spaces built on a monolingual paradigm that wanted to create a citizenship that spoke the one national language. And so there was an assumption that if we take the big rectangle as being the school, that we were schooling students who were English speakers in English-speaking contexts, and that they were monolingual, and that meant that they were proficient. And I think that that's troublesome, but we really began to see that there was perhaps some issues with this identification of individuals as being monolingual, as we saw more and more English learners, or English as a second language learners, or limited English proficient learners, depending on where you are in the world and how they were defined. And so there's been a shift towards understanding that maybe we should not have such a deficit perspective of what students don't bring with them to school. And so in the US context, the term emerged to talk about emergent bilinguals. And the idea behind it was to move away from thinking about what students lacked to foregrounding who they were as bilinguals. And I've had issues with the notion of emerging, largely because I question, when do you count as being bilingual? Is there such a thing as a full bilingual? And then who counts as a full bilingual? In the US context, that has largely meant that you are bilingual when you are fully proficient in English. And so even though it's a more positive view, focusing on bilingualism rather than the lack of English, it still is based on a paradigm that sees, did I go to the right slide? That sees that mastery of English as the dominant language is required. And so we can then think, okay, and largely it was English and Spanish in the US context. But then there has been a move more recently to say, well, let's not call them bilinguals or emergent bilinguals. Let's describe them as being multilingual learners. And that simply meant that we had schools that were filled with children who not just spoke English and Spanish, but they might speak English and Mandarin, or they might speak English and Italian, or they might speak English and Hindi. They could speak a variety of different languages, and so they were multilingual learners. But it was still very much based on this paradigm of monolingualism being the norm. And so we could have two different ways of thinking about multilingual learners: those individuals who had multiple separate monolingualisms, and then those learners who brought with them different languages, but they were bilingual. And I realized I missed filling in this part of the slide. But the way we've seen historically the treatment of including multilingual students has been to move from a more assimilative perspective that would say that the English learner needs to acquire English, towards a supportive environment that would say, we're still going to privilege the majority language of instruction, but we acknowledge that these students speak other languages outside of the classroom. And so there's still this recognition that there are dominant English speakers and there are English learners. And we moved towards a paradigm of inclusion that had said, we're going to privilege the language of instruction, but maybe we'll allow bilingual students to use their linguistic repertoires in limited domains. So we still have the dominant English speaker, but we have now a bilingual learner. So we moved to this inclusion of saying our schools do belong to both monolingual Anglophones or English speakers in English settings and bilingual students. And the question I've been asking as I've been working across various contexts, both in Canada and in France and in the US, has been, is linguistic inclusion sufficient for multilingual schools in the 21st century? Is there, are we meeting the needs of the students who are in our classrooms? And do teachers feel like they are prepared to meet those needs? And so I would suggest that we need to move beyond a bi-multilingual continuum that would see monolingualism at one end and bi or multilingualism at the other, to an entirely different paradigm that Enrique's talked about as a plurilingual paradigm. So instead of thinking along a continuum, we're thinking about a repertoire that all people are going to develop over the course of their lives. And so as Enrique has said, and has kind of become a tagline in a course on multilingual education that I'm teaching, monolingual speakers don't really exist. Only unaware plurilinguals do. And for me, the takeaway here is that the key term for me is the unaware. That as I've been working with teachers in the preparation of teacher candidates, I've realized that we do recognize that our schools and our classrooms have changed. But there is a real anxiety on the part of many teachers that I don't speak the languages of my students. And so how possibly am I going to include them in the classroom? And I don't think that that's out of a fear of wanting to reject something that's unknown. It's actually rooted in the way that we prepare teachers, that they are to be the expert, the linguistic model, and that proficiency is what we model. And so how do we then reconcile the fact that we might not be language models for these other languages? Li Wei has said that we are facing serious post-multilingualism challenges, where simply having many different languages is no longer sufficient, either for the individual or for a society as a whole. But multiple ownerships and more complex interweaving of languages and language varieties, and where boundaries between languages and other communicative means, and the relationship between language and the nation state are being constantly reassessed, broken, or adjusted by speakers on the ground. Concepts such as native, foreign, indigenous, minority languages are also constantly being reassessed and challenged. What is more, communication in the 21st century requires much more involvement with what has traditionally been viewed as non-linguistic means, and urges us to overcome the lingua bias of communication. And I've been struck by the complexity of what Li Wei is arguing here. That really resonates with me, I think, as I struggle with some of the communicative technologies that are ever present, both through students bringing them into the classroom and just in our daily lives. I have an 8-year-old who is continually teaching me how to do things with my phone or with my iPad, or is talking about various apps that they're using at school, and I'm dumbfounded at times because I am not as proficient, I am not as fluent, and I'm not as comfortable. But I think this is the heart of what teaching is, that we become learners and teachers with one another. And so I have been thinking about how, if we have looked at schools as monolingual spaces, what are the messages that we've been sending students? And some of them are that your home language doesn't matter here. Our classroom is a one-language zone. Ici on parle français. Our classroom language is far more important than the language you speak at home. If you learn the classroom language, you will make friends and be accepted. And this is what I heard when I walked into a school for the first time in the US and was introduced to a little girl who had just arrived and was resettling in Madison. And the ESL teacher introduced her saying, "Meet Farnaz, she speaks nothing." And I thought to myself, I'm brand new. I'm being toured around the school by the principal, and I can't believe what I just heard. That a child is being presented to a perfect stranger as someone who speaks nothing. And I've had the opportunity to revisit her at many points over my years in Madison and realize that that became her identity within the school. I was later on in the year working with the classroom teachers, and one of the teachers said to me, "You know, it's really too bad that she speaks nothing." And this was her classroom teacher. That there was a feeling of it's not my responsibility because I don't speak her language. I don't even know what language she speaks. But I don't know how to facilitate her interaction. And so she's just become the student who speaks nothing. And last year, before I left Madison, I was back in the school, and several students were working on an activity, and I came over and I had asked her about the work she was doing, and one of the other students said, "Oh, she doesn't speak anything, so we just speak for her." And so this is why I think it's important how we describe students, how we talk about students, how we name and label them matters. And we have a lot of work to do. And I keep saying we need all hands on deck to recognize that not only can we recognize that this type of naming is destructive for a child's well-being, but I think it's also destructive for the other children in the class who are learning that this type of labeling is okay. That it's appropriate to be seeing people on this spectrum of only being speakers if they speak English. And so I ask, how can we see schools as spaces that support plurilingualism? And Blomart, Collins, and Sundberg have talked about the fact that a lack of communicative competence is not a problem of the speaker, it's a problem for the speaker, lodged not in individual forms of deficit or inability, but in the connection between the individual's communicative potential and the requirements produced by the environment. So if we look at the individual, represented here by that circle, and we think about the macro institutional context in which we navigate our lives, you can see I tried to represent that this individual has a plurilingual repertoire using different colors and different gradations. And that individual then moves through society, through school, through other community-based institutions and home. And as they navigate these spaces, there is either a correspondence or not between their repertoire and what is required by the institution. And so how do we support a greater correspondence between students' communicative repertoires and the linguistic demands of schooling? I think that's something we have to continually hold in tension, because as schools, assessment and proficiency are part of the game. We have goals, standards, expectations that we have to meet, but do we have to do it in a way that is destructive? Or could we come to a vision of schooling that would say you shouldn't finish school with less than you started? Because what we're doing right now is we're taking multilingual or plurilingual children as they come in and they leave as monolingual speakers. And in a knowledge-based economy where languages have value in many different ways, shapes, and forms, in addition to the cultural value they bring, we are sacrificing so much. And it's not just that the students themselves are losing these languages, but we are losing as a society the opportunity to leverage those resources for the entire future. And so how do we think differently about inclusion? George Day, who's here, has said inclusion is not bringing people into what already exists. It is making a new space, a better space for everyone. A space that values, acknowledges, and brings to the forefront those on the peripheries. And so what might that look like? Well, this is my attempt to try and see what might schools look like if we thought differently about linguistic diversity. And here I would suggest that we need to move beyond inclusion towards expansion that has a view that promotes the collaborative development of all students, critical multilingual language awareness, and their linguistic repertoires, so that we do away with this binary between the monolingual, proficient, dominant speaker and the bilingual learner, and both people become plurilingual actors. That they have a responsibility, all, to expand their repertoires, because they are invited into schools that are multilingual spaces and require us to be both multilingual speakers and listeners, or plurilingual individuals. And I think that we do this, we move towards becoming aware plurilinguals, to borrow Enrica's term, from unaware to aware. We do this through fostering language awareness. And I think that my time in the US would say it's not just language awareness in the singular, but a critical multilingual, more than one language, language awareness. And Cummins has said that fostering language awareness represents a powerful instructional strategy for all students. But for immigrant and marginalized group students, it can mean the difference between academic success and failure. And so when we shift the demands of the environment to say that our expectation is that all students are going to develop a plurilingual competence over the course of schooling, then suddenly we're in an environment where we can have discussions, critical discussions about power. And for me, that's what's at the heart of a linguistically expansive paradigm for teaching, that we put power at the center of classroom dialogue about languages, their speakers, and linguistic and cultural diversity. Because language is never neutral, and teaching is never neutral. Lesson planning is political, and we need to be thinking about that in the way in which we prepare for the students who are in our room. And so I have taken the original work that was done in the early 90s around language awareness and the domains of language awareness to think about how do we conceptualize them as critical related to power, multilingual language awareness. And so I've taken the 5 domains that have been cognitive, affective, performance, social, and power. And I put power in the center because I think it's an important thing that we have to be talking about, particularly in the world that we live in today. But I would say that the way that I have come to understand these domains or look at them is that the cognitive and the affective are what we don't see. It's what's happening inside the individual. And so we have both the cognitive, the metalinguistic, the metacognitive aspects of language learning, how languages work and how we learn them. And then we have the affective dimension, which is all the social, emotional feelings associated with languages, language learning, and language users. And those are not necessarily, they're internal to the individual. And what we see externalized is the performance. So what students are able to do with their language and literacy skills, the flexibility they're able to demonstrate, or the translanguaging that they engage in. And the social, relating to their linguistic and cultural identities in the plural, as well as intercultural aspects of language learning and building relationships with diverse language users. So, with this framework that's theoretical, I thought, well, what do we do with this in practice? I know, as having been a practicing teacher, having worked with teacher candidates, that sometimes taking theory and putting it into practice is messy. So I worked at building a research practice partnership with a school district where I was in Madison. And research practice partnerships have been described as a systematic but flexible methodology aimed at improving educational practices through iterative analysis, design and development, and implementation based on collaboration amongst researchers and practitioners in real-world settings, leading to contextually sensitive design principles and theories. And in my time in Madison, I came to also work with a team of people in social psychology, and they used to refer to the work that we were doing in schools as going into the wild, because their work was all done in labs. And I thought that's really interesting because schools are kind of wild. They're messy and things don't go according to plan. And that's why building a partnership that is mutually informative for both researchers and practitioners is so critical. Because we have to be there for the long haul. Simply going in and collecting your data and leaving doesn't transform practice. Because there are always going to be things that we are both negotiating. And so one of the schools that I was working with and you read about in the article, it's called Diversitas School. And there are 22 home languages spoken by students there. 29% of them are English learners, which is roughly higher than the district average. 13% of students have special needs, and 46% of students come from low-income backgrounds. What that means in the U.S. context was that 46% of the student population qualify for free and reduced lunch. And I share that because I think it's critical to understand that I was working with schools that were local public schools. This is not an elite private school that can support an elite plurilingualism, which has often been the critique. But this is the reality of schools. I think that you could see the same diversity here in Toronto. And we were able to do the work that we were doing with these children, with these teachers. And we see here on the walls in the school, the school had the highest number of Arabic speakers in the district, and they also had a very large Spanish-speaking community. And so the school values, the principal organized to have them written on the school walls in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and she had to fight hard to get that approved. But she said, it's important for students to be able to see themselves reflected in their environment. And I think that was critical for me in terms of understanding, as I was in many schools, where the rules and behavioral codes were posted in different languages, but nothing that was really positive or supportive. And so I started thinking a lot about the ways in which we use students' languages only to police them. And how if we are going to embrace a plurilingual paradigm for schooling, that we need to be thinking about how do these languages really become part of the environment. And so the questions we started out asking were, what does it look like, sound like, feel like to design teaching for critical multilingual language awareness? How does transforming multilingualism, because I was in the US and plurilingualism was a bad word, and linguistic diversity from a problem into a resource, how does it impact all students? So not just the traditional bilingual learner, but also the monolingual English speaker. And my thought there was that giving English to the English learners is not going to change the power relations between these two communities. And so there is work to be done with both groups. That if we move towards plurilingualism, a plurilingual paradigm, that both the monolingual English speaker and the bilingual or multilingual plurilingual speaker both have work to do. Both need to understand how to interact with one another, to build understanding. And then the last question that continues to animate my thinking is, what supports do mainstream classroom teachers need in order to teach for critical multilingual language awareness? We've seen here in Ontario a shift towards seeing all teachers as teachers who teach literacy. But I think that in the move to recognize that all teachers are literacy teachers, we've erased the fact that all teachers are language teachers. And there is a difference. One that is largely ignored. And I ask teacher candidates all the time, how much of your teacher preparation prepared you to teach language? And I'm even concerned about the amount that they're prepared to teach literacy, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I think that understanding how language works is critical. And many teachers who are native English speakers don't have the language awareness because they were never taught it. And so it's no fault of their own, but I think that there are big questions to be asking and to be wrestling with today about how we prepare teachers to teach language, not just the French as a second language teacher, not just the ESL teacher, but the mainstream classroom teacher. And so we worked at Teaching for Critical Multilingual Language Awareness, and they're now continuing now that I'm here, which I think is fantastic. That is the ultimate goal in a research practice partnership, that it outlives you. And so in the 4 years that I was there, we started by just working with kindergarten and first grade teachers. The principal had come to me and said, I don't know what to do. We have these different languages, and do you think you could come and work with my teachers to try and include them in the classroom? I said, sure. And so we designed a science unit where kids were writing, learning about the life cycle of plants. And each class adopted a plant, they did their research, and then we wrote these books that I described as teaching science through the prism of children's plurilingualism. And at the end of those projects, the principal said, you know what? I need to be doing this with my whole school. She said, would you mind coming back if I hired a teacher to do multilingual project-based learning across my school? Would you help? And I said, sure. Sign me up. And so I worked with this teacher all year, and we designed projects across the entire school, and that was kindergarten through 5th grade. And at the end of that year, the school reported on their climate surveys, which are done every year with parents across the district, as having the highest sense of belonging across the entire district. So let's remember that this was the school with the highest Arabic speaking population, with a significant Spanish speaking population, and that 46% of the families were sending their kids to school qualifying for free and reduced lunch. And these parents were now coming into the school because we had events to celebrate the publication of these multilingual books, and we had events where parents were reading. And so the next year she said, well, I think that we need to be doing more than just doing these projects in their classrooms. I think that we should actually be teaching multilingual strategies and about linguistic diversity. We have like a 30-minute prep period that every class gets, and the teacher's retiring. If we use that as like a multilingual REACH class, which REACH was the designation for that time period, do you think that you could design curriculum with the teacher and teach it across kindergarten to grade 5? Well, as a matter of fact, there are lots of programs that have been developed in Europe, internationally, that focus on developing language awareness. And often these programs have looked at helping students become familiar with languages they don't know. And my sense in working with schools over the last decade has been that we don't now need to expose children to languages that they don't know or don't come in contact with. We can take the local, ecological, environmental resources and put them to work in the classroom to reposition students and to harness the diversity that is already there. And so that's what we did. We started developing a 30-minute weekly instructional period from kindergarten to grade 5. And then the following year, word got out because teachers are very good at stealing. I don't think it's stealing. I think it's borrowing and sharing and collaborating when things work. And so other schools in the district started saying, well, could you come and do that with us? And we said yes, because what happens is that a teacher, once they find something that works, is going to internalize it and reproduce it on their own. And so that's why they don't need me there anymore. And that was the goal, that they, are doing things that are blowing my mind when I check in and hear about what's happening. And so now they've moved into two-way immersion schools, which are different than the French immersion schools here. They have 50% of the students are Spanish speakers and 50% are English speakers, and they're supposed to be language models for one another. And typically, these schools have adhered to strict language separation, so that you can only speak English during English time and only speak Spanish during Spanish time. And the thought of including other languages was rather mind-boggling, and yet we did it. And so it comes back to something that Jim Cummins had said when I was here as a doctoral student, that actuality implies possibility. That if we see something happen in practice, that it means that it is possible, and then we need theory to be able to explain it. And this is the way in which practice drives theory building and vice versa. And I would suggest that actuality doesn't just imply possibility, but it inspires new possibility. That I look at teachers as creative agents, and that's why they're able to take an idea that I had and multiply it in ways that I couldn't have imagined. And so in the pieces you read, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of identity text that Cummins had proposed, about being texts that students invest their identities in and that hold mirrors up to them and reflect them back in a positive light. And I came to see that, schools, our responsibility isn't just to reflect students back in a positive light. It's to refract the possibilities, to show them what they can become. And so I suggested that we needed to take these mirrors and make them into a prism, so that instead of seeing students leave the way they came, in a positive way, that we have students all come together and together collaboratively leave with more. And so I suggested that maybe instead of working with students' languages in an ESL context, we start working with students' languages in a context that requires everyone to participate. And in the various iterations that we've been going through, we came to describe what we were doing as collaborative learning through multilingual inquiry. Recognizing that classrooms are sites of encounter, that they're a privileged site of encounter because they're one space in which people are required, children are required to mix with people who are different than them. And once we leave the K-12 system, that requirement is no longer as necessary. If we look across our room, if you look at institutions of higher education, it is not everybody who is going to pursue higher education. But in the K-12 spectrum, you are required to go to school. So if we can't get right in schools how to live and work and collaborate with one another, I think all bets are off to say that we're gonna do that as adults. So you can disagree with me, but I would say for that reason, I think that there's so much potential to be saying, how can we conceptualize classrooms as locations of possibility? And I think about Bell Hook's work where she said the academy is not a paradise. We know that. But learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, ways to transgress. This is education as a practice of freedom. And I think that this, as a researcher, as a teacher, as a mother, is why I do what I do. Because I think that we have to be able to, particularly at this moment in time in public education, we need to be thinking about how can we see schools becoming these places of possibility. And so at Diversitas, we've done that through establishing this REACH program. And our goals are that we are cultivating students who are explorers, sensitive to linguistic diversity, that they are leaders who can be respectful and encounter one another. They're creators, and that they are scholars. And so we've come up with, across our various years, looking at 5 design principles. The first one being that we draw on the diverse language ecology of the school, thinking about that atemporally, and recognizing that there were languages that were part of this ecology long before we arrived, as well as languages that are there now. And that we need to be seeking out to cultivate and sustain this environment. That we look at parents, family members, and community members as resources. We cannot do this work without them. That we are having students of different language, cultural, and social backgrounds work collaboratively. That collaboration is a key. And that teachers explicitly support students' metalinguistic and critical multilingual language awareness. And this is where it's taken some work. That I think, as a researcher and as someone who has the luxury of being able to think about this as my bread and butter of what I do, it's easier for me to go into a classroom and see this is where you could tease out this piece of awareness or understanding. And teachers don't often have the luxury of being able to read extensively because they are caught in the day-to-day. And so this is where partnership becomes critical. And then that students produce and publish collaborative, critical, and creative multilingual inquiry-based projects. And so what you don't see here is that students aren't writing standardized tests. They are not doing paper and pencil tasks. Instead, that they are practicing in real time and developing strategies that are going to serve them and their communities. And really what we're doing is we're creating a context in which children are going to be able to engage in multilingual, plurilingual interactions. And so this is, I'm going quickly here because I realize how much time we have. This was our attempt at laying out a program, and so we do things like create thematic units where I will share slides, where this was one about families, and we learned family words for signing family names, using YouTube videos, and there were students in the class who had parents who signed. And this one was a mentor text unit where we had Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. If you are an elementary teacher or have young children, you're familiar with the penguin. I call him a penguin and he's a pigeon, but the pigeon. And we had copies of the book in 11 different languages that students then explored, and we were able to draw attention to different concepts of print, conventions, and everybody loved the pigeon. So we all felt safe engaging. And then they get into actually creating different things. With the older students, we did language portraits, And then we also have been doing books. I have a couple of them that came out of our two-way immersion school that we were working with. And you'll notice in the books that are there that they have QR codes, because we realized along the way that families who didn't speak all of these languages said, well, we'd really like to hear what they sound like. And so we were able to then start doing recordings with students and families and include them in the books, which was totally the teacher's initiative, because I had no idea how to create a QR code or even to figure out the technology to work it all together. So we've continued to do this type of thing where we're attaching or tying into grade level curriculum, but teaching it through a plurilingual lens. And that's continued all the way up through grade 5. And so what I want to do in the time that remains, we have, I think, about 10 minutes, is walk you through a few of the interactions that have come about that have continued to animate my thinking about the potentials of this work. And so one of the things that we do after we've created a multilingual book is that we have had kids write thank you notes to people who helped us with translation. And so in this instance, I was in a classroom and I was watching two students. I'm usually circulating, and we have various recording devices so I can capture some of their talk because I think it's fascinating. And so I just written down my notes. Meanwhile, I watched an interaction between two little girls with blonde hair who are both English dominant speakers. One of them, SL, had finished her thank you card and gave it to Amanda, the teacher. Then, as instructed, she offered to help her friend SN with writing her card. SL suggested to SN that she should write thank you in Spanish because she was making a card for a Spanish-speaking student's family who had helped with the translation into Spanish. So SN says, well, I don't know what to write. And SL says, well, you could write thank you in Spanish. Gracias. SN, I don't know how to write in Spanish. SL, okay, well, I'll go to the board and I can tell you the letters. On the board, it was written in Spanish. And so SN says, okay. And SL proceeds to read each of the letters in English to the other girl, SN, and she transcribes the message, gracias, in Spanish, and then continues her note in English. And I thought, as I was watching this interaction, I thought this is very interesting because we have two English-speaking students who are now helping one another write in Spanish. Is this an example of translanguaging? Or is this an example of students building a plurilingual repertoire that they can then use according to need and context? And they recognize the appropriateness of thanking someone in the language that they helped them in. So we continue. Here's another little boy, and he was writing a note to a family that speaks Arabic. And he went up to his friend, who is an Arabic speaker, and he showed him his note, which you can see down here. And he said, you know, did I do it right? So you have to look up. And the Arabic speaker said, well, no, you have to write it the other way. And so, because we read from the other direction. And so then the boy went back, and he rewrote, and he did this little arrow, and then he was like, no, it's the other way. And so he went back again, and he proceeded to write his entire message from the other direction. And when he first brought it to me, I was like, what? Dear Karam's family, thank you for being so kind and helping us make this book.
Very cool.
This is actually very skillful.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
To understand that, you know, he was explaining the directionality of print. His other friend understood it and said, okay, so what you've told me is that they read from the other direction. And so he says, so I guess they read the English that way too. And so he very carefully took time to write it out. And honestly, when I first saw it, I didn't understand what was going on. And then I realized, no, he's just written the entire thing in reverse.
Even there,
yes,
still backwards.
Exactly. So very skillful. And so he took it back to his friend again, and his friend started to laugh. And he said, that's very funny because we don't read English in reverse, we read English the other way. And so it was just a moment where these two boys who, you know, have been in school together for 4 years had this moment of exchange where they came to understand something about one another, about their families, and were able to help one another, which was really what I've come to describe as a kairos moment, where time is interrupted because there's a powerful exchange, a shift that occurs. And so I wanted, can I go on for
Oh, sure.
a few more minutes? Okay.
Plus
So this is the principle. Oops.
we don't have.
Research and found that relationships
Let
were
me
like
try.
the most important thing for anything, if you wanted to have success in your schools and with your parents. And so we work a lot on relationships here, but also changing beliefs and believing that all parents want their kids to learn, that all families have something important to give to this school, and that we just need to build relationships with these families. And if we do, I think everything else will happen. Academics will improve, we'll get more parent involvement, and that's what we've been doing the last probably 4 years. The other thing I think that's helpful is we have so many different languages spoken here that we're doing this multilingual project. And so every classroom is creating a project that has something to do with their content, science or social studies. And then they will write it out in English, and then it will be interpreted by the parents in their home language of the kids in that classroom. So it's bringing those families into our classrooms, and I believe those parents feel like they're really a part of that classroom.
So this has been the principal reflecting on just how this is changing the culture of their school. And we've been fortunate to be able to be publishing these books, and eventually one of the parents in the school who doesn't speak another language but was really amazed at the work that she was seeing brought home, and works with the public library, said, I think that we should be putting these into the library. And so the books are now, the library is now purchasing books from the school to sustain this type of project-based learning from year to year. And so now kids know that they can not only get them at the local library that's closest to their school, they're right in the library catalog, you can look them up, but they're also at the downtown central library. And so I think this is the goal, to move beyond a project that has implications just for an immediate class, to saying this is something that as a community, as a school, as a city, this is the type of learning we want our students to be engaged in. But it is not
It stems from a long time ago.
there we go. It's not all like rainbows and sunshine. Just so that we don't leave with that impression. One of the activities when we do mentor text units is we take books, and we've often taken book covers, and this is from The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So we had The Very Hungry Caterpillar in 27 different languages, and we had produced them as little like playing cards, and we were asking students to create categories. How would you group these languages? If you look at the covers that are in different languages, how do you make sense of them? Because you don't speak all of the languages. And this is a conversation that recurred in every class that I observed, more or less. So the researcher, how are you grouping your caterpillars? Student 1, I'm grouping them into multilingual and monolingual, and then we're using the multilingual ones, and then the multilingual ones into ones that use human letters, I mean English letters, and those that don't. Researcher, oh, that's interesting. So tell me more about the ones that you said use English letters. Well, these ones use human, I mean English letters. Why do I keep saying that? Well, that's a good question. Why do you think you keep saying human instead of English? Well, I don't know. Did you realize before that people speak so many different languages? And this refrain of associating English with human letters was something that recurred. And there are, a variety of possible explanations. And so as a researcher, you're trying to think about what are all the possible explanations? The teacher's reaction was, we have to shut this down because what they're saying is extremely problematic. And I said, well, no, it is. There are problematic implications. But I think that what we need to be doing is having a conversation about what the implications of associating some languages as being human and others not. And so I think that what we've been seeing is that difficult conversations are going to arise. And in the US context in particular, if these were conversations about race, there would be a very different protocol to follow. But when we talk about language, for some reason, it's okay for us not to be understanding of people who speak different languages because we don't speak those languages. And I said, but language is the one thing that we can change. We can learn another language. In fact, we should be encouraging people to build understanding. Like these two girls who started writing in Spanish. That there is a capacity. We cannot change our cultural background. We cannot change our racial background. We cannot change so many things, but we can change our linguistic repertoire. And yet we feel in many cases that it's excusable not to do so. And so I've been reading Ellen Scarry's work, and she says, the human capacity to injure other people has always been much greater than its capacity to imagine other people. Or perhaps we should say that the human capacity to injure other people is very great precisely because our capacity to imagine other people is very small. And this is at the heart of plurilingual education. That we are helping students not just to not injure people by beginning to imagine what it's like to be living and breathing and participating in collaborative multilingual encounters. And so we've continued this work, and sometimes it's great. So here's The Little Prince. In the back is one of my grad students, and she's francophone from France, and so she read a chapter of The Little Prince in French, and students were just fascinated. They're entranced to hear these other languages. And we did a similar activity with older students about grouping covers. So you can see The Little Prince is in over 300 languages. We had a field day of trying to find different copies. And so you see that we begin to have students' social representations and categories come out when they do this type of activity. Well, English should go with other European languages. No, because all the others, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, they look the same, but English is different. So we put English in a single category. Yes. And how do you know that's French? Well, because I have more language experience. I speak Spanish. I'm a Spanish person. And so what you see here is that there is this privilege that's associated with English. Like, English has to have its own category. It's not European. It's not, it's just English. And so it's interesting to hear these things surface and then to be able to have a conversation about where do these associations come from? Because we haven't necessarily taught them explicitly, but we know that we pick them up through our interactions. So, so another one where it's not always, it's challenging. We made two families, one with English letters and the other ones. Yes, the languages we can read and the others. We can't read them because they're scribbles. So then you take a deep breath and you're like, okay, there's still work to do. And it's alarming to see things like this said. And if it was working with adults, they wouldn't say these things out loud. But I think that's precisely why we have to do this work with younger students, so that we can have these conversations before they become adults and just keep them in their thoughts rather than verbalizing them. And so here was an activity we did with Draw Me a What? A sheep, and we learned sheep in different languages, and you can see they were written in different languages. Students were trying to draw most of them did draw sheep, and then they were writing the sentence in different languages. And so this was students trying to explain their drawings. And this first student says, "Is this Arabic or Hebrew? I'm confused." Well, I know this one is Arabic because this is how you write my dad's name. Okay, so then this is Hebrew. Well, I chose to use Japanese because it looks cool, and my karate teacher uses Japanese. Well, I chose Spanish because I'm a Spanish person, and my ancestors were Spanish from Spain. I chose Spanish because my dad will be proud. I am mixed. My dad is Mexican and my mother's from Indonesia, so I'm mixed. Well, yes, I did it. I wrote it in Chinese. It was so hard. What the heck? I'm gonna write all the languages if I have enough time. Yeah, me too. And so you see, this is a safe space in which to take risks if you feel comfortable. And if you don't, then you don't write in Chinese. You write in a language that uses letters that you're familiar with. And as we see students grow over the years, now we've seen them doing this type of work now they're into their 5th year, so we've seen them from kindergarten to 5th grade, that it's become normalized that we write in different languages, that we take these risks, and we say things that we might not pronounce perfectly, but it's okay. And so we see this as being a bridge to in middle school where they start taking a second language, that there is more openness to trying to learn another language and use it, rather than thinking about always what they're not doing right. And so let me see, I'm almost at the end. Okay, and so one of the things that often also happens is here's a student saying, well, can you write in Arabic? And the student says, yes. Can you help me? Okay, and so he takes his pen and starts writing. And then students 1 and 3 come back and say, well, it's cool that you can write from the other side. Can you help me too? Okay. And so then you begin to see that students who have these other languages in their repertoires are able to use them, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of building relationships with other students. And so this is what happens when we shift the language requirements of an environment to say, we're going to have some expectations around you producing multilingual texts, that the responsibility then goes to all students. That unless there is some form of multilingual assessment at the end of these multilingual projects, that it's very difficult to get everybody to buy in. So that's something we're thinking about. What does it mean to be engaged in, or what does plurilingual assessment look like? And so this is the moment that has marked me, and I still think about it all the time. I had been working with students for the course of this group. I'd been working with them for 4 years by the time I was leaving, and we had them work in groups with students who spoke different languages than they did, and they produced a collage that responded to the prompt, how does it look and feel to learn in a multilingual classroom? So I had 3 students. I had an Arabic-speaking student, English-speaking, an Anglophone, monolingual Anglophone English-speaking student, and then I had an African-American student in a group. They were creating their collage. And I said, so what title do you want to give to your collage? They produced this work of art. I asked them to create a title. And student 1, the student with blonde hair, blue eyes, Anglophone, says, Reach sucks. This class is called Multilingual Reach. I'm sitting there thinking, I've worked with you for 4 years, please don't say such things, but I can't actually say that, so I'm just, trying not to intervene yet. And so then this Arabic-speaking student says, well, I think it should be called Beautiful Languages, and it was a beautiful collage. And student 1 comes back, and she says, no, that's a stupid name. What do you want? She turns to the 3rd student. I don't know. Reach sucks. Oh, I don't know. Reach sucks? Yeah, Reach sucks. Laughing. Well, student 1 turns back to student 2. Well, it's majority rules and meaningless. This is a democracy here. If you don't like it, you can go back to your country.
How old are they?
They are in 4th grade.
Yeah. They heard it so many times. It's been in their brain, stand somewhere.
Or false?
So, this was nearing the end of my time in Madison. I had invested my heart and soul in this research practice partnership. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I think this is why it's important to be doing this work. But that it is not a linear process. And there's no guarantees.
And it's not just a school.
And it's not just a school. So I think that I can look at this as a researcher and say, oh my gosh, nothing was learned. We did debrief after this. But I think it's important in the context of research to be honest about these things that happen. This is the real story. Language is political. Classrooms are political spaces. And there is work to be done. And so sometimes things go well and we find things that work, which I would say these books are a success. But there's no panacea. There is nothing that's going to solve everything. And so we need everybody to bring what they have to the table to say, how do we continue to build classrooms that are going to be more equitable for all learners? And, I think that there's hope. I think that we have students do these reflections. This is a kindergarten class, and they go through and do a little assessment that is kind of this idea of I can statements, and they assess whether they can do it or they're working on it or not yet. And you can see that over the course of the year, students are recognizing that I can do all of these things with different languages. And I was touched, next year I want to learn more about speaking Turkish, because they have a Turkish speaker in their class, and suddenly that knowledge is valued. And it's not just valued, it's known. I think that I've often been amazed at when I'm working with junior school classrooms where kids don't even know the languages that their peers speak because they've never come into the classroom before. And so starting young, I think that there is hope that we can begin to have these conversations and know how to become more comfortable having these conversations. And so I end with a question: plurilingual competence for all in a post-multilingual era. By adopting a linguistically expansive approach to teaching and learning, teachers can make explicit how all students can draw on and expand their dynamic communicative repertoires as resources for deepening learning and building social ties. As students from different linguistic, cultural, and social backgrounds work collaboratively on creative and critical multilingual content-based projects, they develop their capacity both as speakers and listeners in dynamic multilingual interactions. By design, then, students become invested in supporting one another to accomplish multilingual and multimodal academic work that they could not do alone. And I just leave it as a question because I know that it's not easy. And I'll stop there and just say thank you for letting me share.